Hi, my name is Robert Brugman. I'm professor of architecture, art history, and urban planning at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I wanted to say a few words today about the Ravenna Flagpole, its significance, and also its place in architectural history. Here we are in downtown Ravenna in the 1880s. We're looking at the old flagpole sitting in front of the old county courthouse. Now, when that flagpole blew down in the 1890s, there was a question about what to do to replace it. And I think the founding fathers at that time figured that rather than just put up a similar pole, something in wood, fairly awkward like you see here, they decided to go to the newest technology. And the newest technology at the time was metal technology. Of course, iron technology wasn't new. They have been using iron for structures all the way back to the late 18th century in Britain. We're looking here at the Coalbrookdale Bridge in the Midlands in Britain. This was a bridge that was built out of parts that were done by one of the pioneer iron makers of the time. And you can see that it's a fairly primitive structure, trying to imitate an arch construction as if it were in stone. But in the 19th century, particularly in the United States, there was a tremendous development of the iron technology. All kinds of new forms were created in order to have a very lightweight and very efficient structure. So you're looking at some of those built-up forms, first with bolts. They were fastened together with bolts, and then later with rivets, which were pieces of metal that were then made hot, put through a hole, and pushed and hammered on the other end in order to give a very firm connection. So this was used by the American railroad builders. You're seeing here a truss bridge, a through truss bridge, used for what had become the biggest American industry in the 19th century. These bridges went on to prodigious size. Here's the famous Eads Bridge in St. Louis, one of the largest structures of its kind in the world at the time. Because it was a kit of parts, it could be used for almost any occasion. Here we're looking at Grand Central Terminal in New York City, the terminal before the current one. The great shed behind the head house was made of this steel box lattice that became such an important part of so much of the engineering of the late 19th century. Because it was a kit of parts, it could be used in all kinds of configurations. So, for example, here at the U.S. Capitol, by the time of the Civil War, when the dome had not yet been completed, to complete that dome, no one was quite sure how they were going to do it because the weight of a masonry dome would have been crushing. Instead, the architect T.U. Walter and Montgomery Meigs, the engineer, decided to use this new technology. They created an inside shell of this steel lattice construction, actually iron lattice construction in this case, and then they hung the inside and the outside of the dome on top of that. Same was true with the French engineer Gustave Eiffel, who was called on to make the internal armature for the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. On top of this, again, a steel metal iron lattice, we had the thin sheet metal of the actual sculpture itself by the sculptor Bartholdi. Of course, this construction technique was very useful for building towers. One of the most important uses of these towers was for electric lighting. In a city like San Jose, they decided that rather than have any number of smaller lights along the road, they would put up this giant tower right in the center of town and have a very powerful arc light at the top of it, the idea being that it would light the entire neighborhood. Now, in the end, this wasn't practical and they took this tower down. However, there are still some towers, very few probably, in the United States. Here's one set that still does exist in Austin, Texas, the so-called Moonlight Towers. Another example, very interesting because it seems to be an identical structure to the one in Ravenna, was a pole that was designed and built again by the Van Dorn Company of Cleveland for Palmyra, New York. Now, in this case, it appears that the use of this was as a political party structure to hold banners, to put up banners for the various candidates. The structure sat like the one in Ravenna, right in the main street of town, right in the center. There were hundreds of other uses for these towers and this lattice construction. Here we're looking at two observation towers, both of them in the Black Forest, useful for hikers and others hiking through the forest and then wanting to get up and see the surrounding landscape. The one on the right is a Bismarck Tower, in addition to being an observation tower, one of dozens and dozens of structures that were erected to commemorate the great German figure Bismarck, who had helped unify the country. Of course, the largest of these towers was the Eiffel Tower, and here you're seeing on the left-hand side Monsieur Eiffel himself. He's the one at the bottom, about ready to ascend the stairs up to his office, which was at the very pinnacle of the Eiffel Tower. Now, the Eiffel Tower, of course, was 1,000 feet high, much higher than the Ravenna flagpole. On the other hand, if you think about it for a moment, you realize that Paris was a much bigger city, and per capita there were more feet in the Ravenna flagpole than there were in the Eiffel Tower. Of course, this was very useful, that is, the great height of the Ravenna flagpole, in trying to compete with neighbors. So in 1893, Ravenna put up its flagpole, and then in 1895, Kent, Ohio, nearby, put up its pole. Reportedly, this pole was 150 feet as well. It came down quite a few years ago. Interestingly enough, this competition among places, it continues to this day. So, for example, if you look on the web, you will see that there is a very brisk competition to have the highest flagpole in the world. Here are what are probably the two most important contenders today. You'll note that this competition is no longer among places in the Western world. Cities like Ravenna are now mature enough and confident enough in themselves that they perhaps don't need to try to have the tallest, the biggest, the highest anywhere in the world. Not true in North Korea and Azerbaijan, where we see these two. Interestingly enough, the North Korea flagpole appears to be almost exactly the same technology as the Ravenna flagpole. Now, other interesting thing about this story is that in almost every case that we've looked at so far, these flagpoles were put up to great acclaim and then went through a period when they were thought to be redundant or not useful or ugly, or they cost too much to maintain, and there was a big move to take them down. Interestingly enough, almost all of them managed to survive, at least the ones that we looked at just now, and went through a period where they were under attack, but the community rallied and finally preserved them. It's certainly true of Austin and true of Palmyra. In the case of San Jose, they actually did take down that electric light pole, but after they did, they were so remorseful that they had done that they erected a half-scale replica elsewhere in the city.
I think if Ravenna has one single monument that's really important nationally, it's this Ravenna flagpole. There are plenty of other nice buildings in Ravenna, but they're buildings that tend to be the same in other places around the Ohio and around the nation generally. This is really unique. I think that this building, this structure, more than anything else in the area, reflects the late 19th century ingenuity and engineering expertise that made the United States the great industrial power of the 20th century.